Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. Howdy, everyone, and welcome to the Sports Psych Concepts Lecture Series. Leadership in sport is the topic for discussion this time around. And leadership, of course, is one of those things that has become ubiquitous, at least in the sense of leadership training and we need more leaders and let's invest a bunch of money in these programs to see if we can develop better leaders in our group and lead to better organizational goals or improved outcomes or whatever it may be. And it certainly could be argued that those efforts have been to little avail because there still seems to be this prevalence of mediocrity or lack of cohesion or inspiration amongst different groups, and groups and teams that excel are exceedingly rare. They continue to be rare, even though there has been so much effort and money and investment into these types of programs. So I am certainly not claiming to solve that problem or really offer this as like, well, here's the leadership program that you need to buy into. That's certainly not what my goal is here. It's simply just to explore some important leadership concepts and share a few tips for coaches in particular on how they might be able to employ some of these things, or how sports psychology practitioners, some things they may be able to share with coaches, but just to really explore the topic, because leadership obviously is important. That's why there's so much investment in it, in sport and otherwise. So it's definitely a worthwhile thing to talk about, and hopefully this isn't just a hollow presentation. Hopefully it actually is moves the needle in the positive direction out there and leaves you with something to where you feel like you can actually make a difference in whatever your scope is on that. So with that, let's dive into what I have prepared for you. Now, the first thing that I want to start off with, as I tend to do in these recordings, is just let's get on the same page and define this when we're talking about leadership, and at least in the context of this presentation, because of course there's so much out there. You can find other ways to explain this. You could come up with your own explanation. So for me, I'm just going to share what that perspective is, and there's a couple of keywords that I think really stand out. Leadership is a process. It's not like this end result. It's not just some authoritative position or some title. It's this process. It's ongoing. And in the context of sport and everywhere else, it's a process of influence. The things that we do as leaders to maximize our influence in the positive direction toward some shared goal, some common goal that we as the leaders share with the followers and anybody else in the group. So that's really the way that I like to think about this, a process of influence that helps the team or the group, whoever we're working with, to achieve what their common goal is. Now, I'm sure many examples come to mind. There's some good stuff online, some humorous examples of what leadership maybe looks like that's not so great, and then some contrasting examples of what it looks like in a good way, at least for some teams perhaps. Maybe it wouldn't apply to others, but there's lots of different examples that we can explore on this, but I think this is a good way to think about it. So with that definition in mind, let's look at a few components of leadership development. The things that, if one wants to become a leader, they need to do these things. They need to try and adhere to these development principles. And the first one is in sport, a leader needs to have a high level of sport specific skill and knowledge. They need to know their sport. They need to know what's going on. They need to be able to demonstrate it at a pretty high level, at least at a level that is proficient enough to demonstrate competence that will get buy-in from those athletes that we're working with. So for example, just if one wants to be a professional coach or a collegiate level coach, they don't necessarily need to be the best former player in the world at those levels, but they need to have a high level of competence in terms of sport specific skill. They certainly need to have that in knowledge, and many times they do. Now, there are examples of coaches that perhaps didn't follow that trajectory all of the way, at least on the skill development side, but they really know a lot. They make up for it in their technical and tactical knowledge. Okay, so that's an important piece. They also need to have a very strong work ethic, which is, it seems like this is sort of obvious thing, but this, if we're trying to lead others and we're going to lead them through hard things where there's adversity invariably along the way, a stronger work ethic is required. And so to become a leader, it requires work. Remember, it's a process that we work through, and that way we can have influence by itself is having a strong work ethic, but also by going through that process. Now, the last thing to mention here is that there needs to be some people skills. We have to be able to communicate, connect on a relational level, to inspire, motivate, to provide instruction and direction. All of those things are essential. So if we think about what are the things that if we're gonna create some sort of leadership development program, what might be some of the things that we would do? And again, if we're thinking in the context of sport, it's going to be coaches, maybe it'll be team captains, right? They're going to spend a lot of time increasing their knowledge and understanding of the sport, and they're going to work their tails off, and in all of these areas, including improving their ability to communicate and work with people, because that's an essential part of it. So if we're putting together some program, we build it around these things, these sorts of things, and hopefully that is intuitive and it makes sense. Now, so let's talk next about different types of leaders. And I'm just going to give you some broad categories. We could extend this and maybe include more, but I'm going to try and narrow it down a little bit further for you, so it you have a simple sort of takeaway. But the first type of leader would be a relationship oriented leader. Okay, so if there's this relational component, that's the emphasis. Like, if I'm going to ask you to do difficult things, if I'm going to push you to the brink or the edges of your ability, well, by golly, you better know that I care about you. And so my focus is on developing and maintaining very solid connections and relationships with my athletes, with my players. And so coaches or leaders who take this approach, they'll spend a lot of time on that, right? It's just building the connection and feeling like the team members feel love, they feel compassion, they feel care, they feel supported, they feel understood, all of those different things that come there. Okay, so now I think it's important to mention that this lies on a spectrum. So every coach, every leader will have this to some degree, but some lean more heavily on it than others. Now, the other broad type of leader here in terms of the categorization is you have task-oriented leaders, okay? Relationship-oriented leaders and task-oriented leaders, where the task-oriented leaders, it's not so much about the relationship, it's about driving and directing traffic and getting things done. What is the goal? How do we move forward on this? If we need to adjust the goal, then we can shift that goal, but how do we get things done? Very task-oriented, okay? So as you can probably imagine, or you probably are, like, all right, well, I see some pros and cons of each of these, and that's absolutely true. We don't want to overly rely on one or the other, and some coaches do this. You'll have a players coach, right? More relationship oriented, and the players love them and they feel satisfied, but they don't really maybe feel like it's the most effective in terms of performance. And then you have some task-oriented leaders that maybe get a lot done, but the athletes aren't super satisfied. They don't feel like they're cared for. They're not enjoying their experience as much. So ideally, the leader will match whatever the situation calls for and the athletes involved, and they'll adapt their approach to that. So when there's a need for a relational approach, they'll use that. When there's more of a task oriented focus with or requirement of the situation, then they'll use that. And so this is something that's acquired through experience over the years, where coaches learn to kind of match and adapt what they need to do to the demands of the situation. So there's some general background on those concepts that I hope are helpful. Now let's shift away to the classic question of what a leader is versus what a manager is. Man, this is such a one of those fun academic-y type concepts to explore, to see, well, and have a conversation. It's like, well, are leaders managers or managers leaders? And it's like, well, yeah, there's just like everything else. There's overlap, there's nuance to this, but it can be helpful to pull them apart to really understand the differences. And really, managers are all about, you know, systems and organization and planning and administration and those sorts of things, where you oh, I guess one way to think about it is you lead people and you manage things. Okay, you manage the schedule, you manage the budget, you organize the practice plans, those sorts of things, right? That's what managers do. Where leaders, you're leading people, you're providing a vision or direction for the team and what it is you want to accomplish along the way. And so yes, and when we look in the context of sport, coaches are doing all of these things, especially at say youth and high school levels, where there aren't large staffs that have people on staff with their specific job, is to manage different things, right? Manage the recruiting calendar, for example, would be something that college coaches would maybe do, or they organize the film session that the team's going to go through. There's so many different examples, okay? But most coaches, they're doing both of these things to some degree, okay? Both of them to some degree. But what I am emphasizing here is the leadership side of this. It's that vision, it's that transcendent piece that goes beyond all of that, and it gives direction or purpose for all of the things that are being managed. How does that all fit into the vision, the direction that we're moving? All of the things that we're doing, all right, let's manage them, but around this context that is provided by the leader. So several different models exist out there, frameworks that we could use to try and explore leadership, but one that's been around for a while is the multidimensional model of sport leadership. And essentially, without getting too far out there into the details of this, I'm just going to try and give you the simplified explanation. But basically, if we look at leadership situations, there's a few things that we're probably going to see across all of those. Okay, so you're going to have whatever the leader's characteristics are, the things that they bring to the table, their personality, their particular uh, style or philosophy, their communication approach, whatever. There's a long list of things. There's the leader characteristics and there's the situational characteristics, just what it is that's going on in the moment. Is it practice? Is it competition? Is it pregame? Is it postgame? Where are they at in the season? All of those things in the situation. And then you have the team member characteristics, right? What's the makeup of the team? What's their age? What sorts of experience do they have? What type of maturity? What's their skill set? What's their family background, right? Dynamics of what might be affecting how they are. So you have all of those things in the every leadership situation, right? Leader characteristics, the situational characteristics, and then the team member characteristics. Now in sport, we want both optimal performance and high levels of athlete satisfaction. Okay, we want both of those things. That would be the desired things. Is that we're getting, yeah, we're increasing performance, but not at the not by sacrificing the satisfaction of the athletes, and vice versa, right? We don't just want, well, they're satisfied with their experience and that they're having fun and all of that, but they're not really very good at the sport. They don't perform very well. They lose a lot, but they're like the happiest losers out there, right? And obviously, maybe that's there's either of those would be maybe better than nothing, depending on the perspective that you take on that. But let's just say that the ideal is we want optimal performance and optimal satisfaction. So how do we achieve that with in these different leadership situations, right? How do we take into account all of those things? And so the one way to think about this, according to the multidimensional model of sport leadership, is that the leader characteristics, situational characteristics, and team member characteristics are all going to interact. And in that situation, there's a specific behavior of the leader that is required, and then there's the specific behavior that may be preferred by the team members, and then there's the actual leader behavior, what they actually did. Now, the ideal here is that all of those things line up. The required be if the situation calls for the coach to discipline an athlete, that is what is required, and but the leader does not do that, and maybe that is also the preferred behavior, like the athlete maybe doesn't want to be disciplined. Those aren't in alignment, right? It doesn't match up. And so it's like, all right, well, how do we get these things to match up? Maybe there's a preferred way, a better way that an athlete, this is what's required in the situation. We can acknowledge that. And so the leader is going to go in and discipline an athlete. And by discipline, I don't mean like it's punish or whatever, it's there's lots of ways that could be described or achieved. So what is the preferred leader behavior if they are going to discipline an athlete? Maybe there's a particular way they can go about that. Maybe they're not calling them out in front of the entire team and humiliating them and belittling them or whatever, things that we see far too often, I would say, on that. Okay, we're trying to get these things aligned. So this is a way for coaches just to kind of gauge and look more objectively at different situations. All right, well, what does this situation call for, right? And what is going to be the preferred thing from the athlete's perspective, right? Or maybe even the leader's perspective. And then what is it that I'm actually going to do? Because we can use it to kind of guide our decisions. And we certainly can use it, to understand the situation. But the point here, the main point, again, to reiterate, is we want alignment between what the situation calls for and what might be a preferred behavior and what we actually do. When leaders do that and they lead this way consistently, that's what leads to higher levels of performance and higher levels of satisfaction among athletes. So let's shift now away from the multidimensional model and talk about transformational leadership. This is certainly a very popular and well accepted approach to leadership. It seems almost like it has been accepted in pretty much every context, even though interestingly, there are some situations where maybe more of a transactional approach may be more appropriate. But I'm not going to get too deep into that right now, because I just want to introduce this idea of transformational leadership as, again, we're kind of focusing on the ideal. So maybe there are some situations where transactional leadership would fit, and there's some athletes and contexts. I've talked to different coaches in particular that the athletes they were working with didn't respond very well to a transformational approach. They were more interested in transactional things, and it seems like there's a shift in society in that direction. So, as I said, I don't want to get too far off point on that. Transformational leadership, I'm going to share with you the core principles here, but essentially it's like we're seeking transformation. The leader is really adopting this visionary position and trying to inspire their team to follow that vision and work together in a supportive way to help each other excel. And there's certain components of this, like the leaders have to be able to motivate and inspire their team members to achieve those new heights that they haven't achieved before and accomplish more than maybe they thought that they could on their own. And so even though I mentioned the maybe exceptions, maybe there may be times when transactional would be appropriate in a situation, and there may be some nuance here to where maybe leaders adopt one in one situation, they kind of adapt that. Like in general, the transformational leadership is thought to be more effective than transactional for reinforcing some of those positive things. But there are four primary components that make up transformational leadership. The first is idealized influence. So the leader is a role model. They are supposed to demonstrate the ideal. This is what it looks like. I'm showing you the ideal. We're aiming for it, but I'm also living it myself. And it's a great way to earn trust and the admiration of followers. So something that coaches can do. I think of a lot of coaches that, for example, if a coach is not in great physical fitness themselves, right? This is maybe a simplistic example, but just say they're not in overly great shape themselves, don't dedicate a lot of time to that, and they're expecting their athletes to do that, to invest and engage in strength and conditioning, and the coach isn't doing that or is not participating that in any way to demonstrate that. That would be an example where there would be, maybe they're not showing the idealized influence, at least in that way. Maybe they'd be showing it in other ways. Okay, so the next component of transformational leadership is inspirational motivation. So motivation is a key part of what leaders do, right? We motivate followers by how we convey the vision, and we want to do it in a way that's compelling, that shows where the group is going to go, what they can do, and all the while encouraging the team along the way to take challenging risks and work and do things that need that bit of juice, right, infused into them. So we have idealized influence and inspirational motivation. The next one is intellectual stimulation. So this is just all about innovation, right? Finding new ways to do things, looking at things. This is intrinsically motivating, to be stimulated, to learn new things, to try creative ways to solve problems. And so in the coaching sense here, it's providing athletes with opportunities to do this, to help make decisions and help solve the problem rather than just stepping in and always solving that for them. That would be an application of this. And then the last component of transformational leadership is individualized consideration. So we can't, there's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not one size fits all in how we serve our athletes or our followers. And so this is all about recognizing those individual needs that we see in each of the team members, right? So those are the four components of transformational leadership. As I said, so much more could be said about that. You want to learn more, I'm sure you can explore online and find different things. But I do think that there are some good guiding principles there and practical applications that can come out of this. So the next thing I want to share with you is servant leadership. Another sort of domain, certainly has some overlap with transformational leadership, but servant leadership kind of stands alone as its own thing. It's really this simple approach. I mean, servant leaders, they really focus on, they see their position in leadership as not some authority, not I'm above others, but it's a position to serve others, where the leader is trying to create followers who can build something better, right? The next day, over the course of the season, the path, everything they're working on. So their focus is on the growth and the development of the team members rather than building up the organization itself, right? That's what the focus is on. It's like, I'm serving these members, and if I do that, then it'll lead to these results in the organization. And it tends to, predict organizational goals pretty well, if in terms of like that just basic understanding of like, well, yeah, if you focus on developing your people, then within the organization, the team, all of that, it's it's going to lead to those sorts of results. Now, there hasn't been an incredibly deep amount of research on this particular topic in the sports psychology literature, but there are emerging studies and ideas and evidences coming around to support this, to support that in those contexts. So it'll be interesting to see how this gets tied to other types of sport specific outcomes in the future. All right, so with those conceptual frameworks now kind of floated out there to you as different approaches that that could be used, that may be helpful, let's try and get a little bit more specific on the types of things that characterize effective leadership. And everything that I've shared so far, it kind of feeds into this, but we can boil this down a little bit further. So there's a few there's a few components to talk about here. The first is situational factors. Okay, so effective leaders, obviously, they're taking those things into context, and I know I've kind of mentioned this related to the multidimensional model of leadership, so you can see that alignment there. But just so well, are working with team athletes or is it individual athletes? Is it more an interactive type of sport where athletes are relying on each other, or is it more a coactive type of sport? How big is the team? Is it a junior varsity? Is it a varsity team? How much time do we have available for practice? What would be a sort of traditional leadership style in this this setting, or what might be the experiences of these these team members with leadership in the past, and how might that affect the situation? Okay, so we have situational factors that effective leaders take into account. They also take into account their followers' qualities. So same things that I mentioned earlier with the experience, maybe the gender, you're working with a men's team, a women's team, how old are they, what type of experience, what's their family background. If you're working with college or pro sports, do they come from different countries? You got a mix of athletes from different places. All of those things are important considerations. You also have the leader qualities, as I mentioned earlier as well, and this is usually kind of the fun thing. Like if I think about an academic setting, if I were to ask some students in the leadership class to say, all right, well, what are the qualities of a good leader, right? And then we can make this list of them. And a lot of times they come up with things like, well, they got integrity, they're loyal, they're confident, they've got candor, they're willing to say things that other people maybe have a hard time saying, but they do it in a way that shows care. They're patient, they have discipline, they're always prepared, super accountable. All those wonderful things that we can name, right? And then there's just different qualities. They mobilize people. They focus on the how to maximize the resources that they have available. So if there's coaches, how do we maximize the physical, the mental, the technical, the tactical? There's emotional things, and then that's for them. But then how do they do that within their team members as well? So those are all things that we can readily identify, and there's some good examples you can find online as well. And then you have the leadership style. Are they using more of a democratic approach or an autocratic approach? And what's their decision-making style? And what's the best style for the situation? Okay, so these are all things that, again, if we're just trying to understand leadership and these different ways of looking at it, how we can characterize it, this can be helpful, right? It can be helpful. We can readily identify these things through our experience. I imagine most people listening to this, you've been exposed to a good leader and probably not so good of a leader. And so that kind of shapes our perspective on this. But there's lots of examples of great leaders out there that we can study and try and understand what it is that they did, and find those things that really we can improve on, but then the things that we already have some level of strength in, and then adapting that with our own personal approach and personality, and then that can lead to effective leadership. So a lot of programs are aimed at these sorts of things. All right, so I want to finish with a few tips for coaches. Certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's kind of nice to have some specific, tangible things that we can use that are characteristic of good leaders. So the first one is to provide reinforcement right after positive behaviors occur. So acknowledging those things that we want to have happen and reinforcing them. That'll increase the likelihood that they happen again. Obviously a good thing, something we want to aim for. We also want to reinforce effort as much as the results. So we don't want to create an environment where they only get praise when they do something exactly perfectly. Like if they're trying and they're working through those improvement, the process of improvement, we want to make sure we do that. It seems like an obvious thing, but it's good to have a reminder to do that. We also want to provide encouragement and corrective instruction right after they make mistakes. So step in, and you can use different techniques on how to do this, but we want to correct what it is that they're doing. Give them that correction. And it doesn't mean we go in and we say, hey, this is what you did wrong. We also want to emphasize what they do well. Even if they really didn't do much well, it's finding a way to frame it in a way as if they're still improving when they're trying. So for example, hey, more of this on the next time, right? More of this. Because when you say, even if they didn't really do it that much, you're saying, hey, more of this one particular thing on the skill. In their mind, what they're hearing is like, okay, so I did that to a little bit. I just need to do more of that, right? That's the message that they receive, rather than saying, oh man, no, you didn't do it. You need to do this, right? They're thinking, oh, I didn't do it. Okay, so more of this one thing that you want can help them understand that, and especially if we provide corrective instruction, good technical cues for them. Okay, we also want to avoid punishing athletes when they make a mistake, because then that'll lead to this fear of failure where they don't want to take risks. And in order to excel and improve, we have to take risks, which means we're going to push our limits, we're going to make mistakes, and so we're going to fail. And so if we get punished every time we do that, well, then that's going to interfere with our willingness to take risks. And so we really got to be cautious with that as leaders in those situations. It's also important to set clear expectations. Help them know what it is expected of them, so then they can rise to meet that standard. And it's okay to have high standards, obviously. It's just they need to know what that standard is so they have the opportunity to meet that. Now, I've mentioned a little bit about positive reinforcement and encouragement and all those things. It doesn't mean that everything we do, everything an athlete does has to be followed with, oh, good, like amazing, good job, like consistently, because then it's meaningless, right? I've mentored a few coaches where I've shared that information with them as I'm kind of watching them coach, and we have a discussion and different things, and it just loses meaning if it just comes out and it's so cheaply applied. So we want to use encouragement very intentionally to maintain the value and the meaning of that. And lastly, when we are providing technical instruction, we want to be very clear and concise. We don't want to overload athletes. This is another thing I've seen coaches do, is they'll get so excited, and I've been guilty of this myself. They get so excited and they just start breaking down a skill and talking about all these different components, and the athlete kind of gets lost, and then they go out there and they were worse than they were before because they're thinking about all of these things. So when we provide technical instruction, we want to be very clear, concise. Make sense of leaders in any situation. We're trying to be very obvious, and these are what the expectations are here. This is how you can do it. Go and do it. And if other things aren't clear, you have permission to explore and be creative and try and solve the problem. So those are just a few tips. As I said, there's so much more. Leadership is a massive topic. Here we are. You got a 30-minute recording on just a few ideas, but I hope that it's helpful. Hopefully it makes sense in the context of sport and sports psychology, and you have a few ideas you can take with you to apply in your own work. So thanks for listening. Take care. Thank you for listening to this recording. I hope you learned something about sports psych, perhaps something you didn't know before, and maybe even something you can apply in your life more generally. If you liked what you heard, feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit my website at fehradvantage.com, or visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify.